October 24th, 1944. The Sibuyan Sea, Central Philippines. Through the periscope of his fire control station aboard the heavy cruiser Haguro, Lieutenant Commander Tameichi Hara watched something that contradicted every principle of naval gunnery he had learned at Etajima Naval Academy. An American battleship, hull down beyond the horizon, was dropping 16-inch shells within 200 yards of his cruiser. The enemy vessel was so far away that Hara could not see it with his optical rangefinder. Yet somehow, impossibly, those massive projectiles were arriving with terrifying consistency, each salvo walking closer to his ship. Hara had been fighting at sea since 1941. He had survived dozens of naval engagements. He understood gunnery. At extreme ranges beyond 20,000 yards, hitting a moving target was supposed to be nearly impossible. The calculations required were staggering. You had to account for the curvature of the Earth, wind direction at multiple altitudes. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Temperature, the rotation of the planet itself. Even with perfect mathematics, shells scattered. At 23 miles, the margin of error should be measured in thousands of yards, not hundreds. Yet the American shells kept falling, precisely, methodically, as if guided by some invisible hand. What Hara was witnessing was not luck. It was not even exceptional seamanship, though American gun crews were superbly trained. What was landing those 2,700-pound shells with such devastating accuracy was technology the Imperial Japanese Navy had not fully grasped existed: radar fire control, electronic computing. A revolution in naval warfare that had arrived so quietly that Japan's admirals did not realize the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed until American shells began falling from beyond the visible horizon. The Iowa-class battleships represented more than raw power. They were the marriage of traditional naval artillery and cutting-edge technology. And in the desperate battles of late 1944, that marriage would shatter Japanese confidence in their own naval doctrine. To understand why Japanese commanders were so stunned by the accuracy of Iowa-class gunnery, we must first understand what naval combat looked like in the years before radar changed everything. For centuries, naval gunnery had been a craft practiced through human skill and optical instruments. A ship's fire control team used rangefinders, massive optical devices that measured the distance to a target through triangulation. These instruments were remarkably precise in daylight and clear weather. Japanese rangefinders, particularly those mounted on the Yamato-class battleships, were among the finest in the world. Some measured over 45 feet in length and could determine range accurately to within 50 yards at distances of 20 miles. But optical rangefinding had fundamental limitations. In darkness, fog, rain, or smoke, it became nearly useless. The human eye, no matter how well trained, could only see so far, and at extreme ranges, even perfect range data was insufficient. Calculating a firing solution required accounting for dozens of variables that changed with each passing second. The target's speed and course, your own ship's motion, wind speed at the shell's apex, sometimes 30,000 feet above the ocean, air temperature and density, the Earth's rotation, which could deflect a shell hundreds of yards over a 20-mile flight. Before World War II, these calculations were performed manually by teams of officers using mechanical computers. The most sophisticated was the British Admiralty Fire Control Table, a mechanical analog computer that used gears, cams, and differential mechanisms to solve ballistic equations. Japan developed similar systems. The Type 98 fire control computer, introduced in the late 1930s, was a mechanical marvel. American pre-war fire control and systems were comparable. These mechanical computers worked, but they were slow. Updating a firing solution took minutes. If the target changed course or speed, the calculations had to begin again. More critically, all these systems depended on accurate range data, which required optical sighting of the target. If you could not see the enemy ship, you could not hit it. This fundamental limitation shaped naval doctrine for every major navy. Battleships were expected to fight at ranges of 15 to 20,000 yards, roughly 8 to 11 miles. At those distances, optical rangefinders worked reliably. Hits were possible, though still difficult. Engagements at greater ranges were considered impractical. The Imperial Japanese Navy embraced a doctrine of decisive engagement at moderate range. Japanese officers trained relentlessly in night combat, where superior optical equipment and training might give them an edge. The massive 18-inch guns of the Yamato-class battleships were designed to outrange any potential opponent, allowing Japanese ships to stand off at 25,000 yards, while enemy vessels could not reply. This doctrine assumed that everyone was playing by the same optical rules. American battleships completed in the early 1940s, the North Carolina and South Dakota classes, were designed under this same paradigm. Their 16-inch guns could reach out to nearly 23 miles theoretically, but practical combat ranges were expected to be much shorter. Gunnery doctrine called for closing to 15,000 yards or less for decisive action. The Iowa-class battleships, laid down between 1940 and 1942, initially followed this same thinking. They were designed primarily for speed, to escort fast carrier task forces while providing enough firepower to handle enemy cruisers and battleships. Their main battery of 9 16-inch 50-caliber Mark VII guns was essentially the same weapon carried by earlier American battleships. But something changed during their construction. A revolution in naval technology that would transform these ships from fast battleships into something unprecedented. Radar. The development of fire control radar marked one of the most significant technological leaps in naval history. British scientists had pioneered radar for aircraft detection in the late 1930s. By 1940, British and American researchers were adapting the technology for naval gunnery. The challenges were immense. A radar system capable of tracking ships at 20-mile ranges required enormous transmitter power and sophisticated receivers. The antenna had to be large enough to focus the beam precisely. The electronics had to distinguish between the target and wave clutter, between enemy ships and friendly vessels. American scientists at the Naval Research Laboratory, working with industrial partners including Bell Laboratories and General Electric, achieved breakthroughs rapidly. By 1942, the first production fire control radars entered service. The Mark III radar, introduced in 1942, could track surface targets at ranges exceeding 20 miles. The Mark VIII radar, which entered service in 1943, provided even greater range and accuracy. These systems were integrated with the Mark 38 gun fire control system, an analog computer far more sophisticated than pre-war mechanical systems. The Mark 38 automatically received range and bearing data from the radar, combined it with ship motion data from gyroscopes and speed indicators, factored in ballistic data for the specific shells being fired, and continuously calculated an updated firing solution. The entire process was automatic. As long as the radar tracked the target, the guns stayed on target. The practical effect was staggering. An Iowa-class battleship equipped with Mark VIII radar and the Mark 38 fire control system and could engage enemy ships in complete darkness, in fog, or at ranges beyond the visible horizon. The fire control solution updated continuously, meaning the guns tracked moving targets automatically. American gunners could fire salvos at 30-second intervals, with each salvo adjusted based on the fall of the previous shots, all without ever seeing the target. This capability was so revolutionary that even American officers initially struggled to believe it worked as well as it did. Early war games and training exercises produced results that seemed almost impossible. Battleships were hitting targets at ranges and under conditions where hits should have been statistically improbable. For the Japanese, who had no equivalent technology, the first encounters with radar-directed American gunnery seemed like something beyond comprehension. It appeared almost supernatural. The first Iowa-class battleship, USS Iowa herself, was commissioned on February 22, 1943. Her shakedown cruise and initial training took place in the Atlantic, including escorting President Franklin Roosevelt to the Tehran Conference in November 1943. During these early months, her crew mastered the radar fire control systems that would soon shock Japanese commanders. USS New Jersey, the second Iowa to be completed, was commissioned on May 23, 1943. Unlike Iowa, New Jersey steamed directly for the Pacific Theater. She arrived at Pearl Harbor in January 1944 and immediately joined the fast carrier task forces. Her first combat action came in February 1944 during the assault on the Marshall Islands. It was during these operations that Japanese forces first encountered Iowa-class gunnery under combat conditions. The results were unlike anything they had experienced before. On February 17, 1944, New Jersey bombarded Japanese positions on Eniwetok Atoll. The range was approximately 21,000 yards, nearly 12 miles. Japanese observers reported that American shells were landing consistently within a 100-yard radius of designated targets. Bunkers were being destroyed by individual shells, not by area bombardment. This level of precision at such range was unprecedented. What Japanese observers did not know was that New Jersey's gun crews were not even looking at the targets through optical sights. The fire control radar painted the island clearly on its scope. The Mark 38 computer calculated trajectories accounting for the shell's 23-mile ballistic arc. Corrections were made automatically after each salvo. The guns were essentially firing at electronic coordinates, and those coordinates were precise. Commander Masatake Okumiya, a Japanese naval staff officer who later interviewed survivors of these bombardments, recorded their bewilderment. The Americans were destroying individual pillboxes from distances where we could not even see their ships clearly. Our coastal defense officers assumed aircraft must be spotting for the battleships. But even with aircraft spotting, such accuracy seemed impossible. The shells arrived with such consistency that our troops believed the Americans had developed some form of guided munition. They had not. The shells were entirely conventional. What had changed was the ability to aim them with inhuman precision. The mechanics of the Mark 38 fire control system deserve detailed examination because this system was the key to Iowa-class accuracy. The Mark 38 consisted of several integrated components. First, the Mark 8 fire control radar provided continuous range and bearing data. The radar antenna, mounted on a rotating director platform, could track a target automatically once locked on. Range accuracy was approximately 25 yards. Bearing accuracy was about 1/4 of a degree. This data fed into the Mark 38 computer, a room-sized analog computing system located deep within the ship. The computer was a marvel of electromechanical engineering. It used hundreds of servo motors, gear trains, cams, and differential mechanisms to solve complex ballistic equations continuously. Operators fed in data about wind speed, air temperature, powder temperature, which affected muzzle velocity, and the specific ballistic characteristics of the ammunition being used. The computer also received continuous data from the ship's gyro compass and speed indicators. This allowed it to account for the ship's own motion. If the Iowa was heeling in a turn, the computer adjusted. If she was pitching in heavy seas, the computer calculated when to fire so the shells would be launched when the ship was level. The output from the computer went to the gun mounts themselves. Hydraulic systems automatically trained the guns to the calculated bearing and elevated them to the calculated angle. Gunners did not aim manually. They simply monitored indicators to ensure the guns were following the computer's orders. When the fire control officer pressed the firing key, all guns in a turret fired simultaneously, their barrels aimed at a precise point in space where the computer predicted the target would be when the shells arrived. After firing, spotters observed the fall of shot. With radar, this could be done even if the target was beyond visual range. The radar could detect the splashes of shells hitting the water. If a salvo fell short, the computer adjusted automatically for the next salvo. This feedback loop meant that accuracy improved with each salvo fired. By the fourth or fifth salvo, hitting a moving ship at 20 miles became not just possible, but probable. Japanese battleships had nothing comparable. Their fire control systems, while sophisticated, were entirely optical and mechanical. The Type 98 computer was slower to calculate and required manual input of range data. More critically, it could not function if the rangefinders could not see the target. Japanese ships could fire accurately at targets they could see. American ships could fire accurately at targets they could only detect electronically. This technology gap manifested most dramatically during night engagements. The Imperial Japanese Navy had trained extensively for night combat, considering it a potential advantage. Japanese crews practiced night optical gunnery relentlessly. The theory was sound. In darkness, neither side could see well, but superior training and dedication might tip the balance to Japan. Radar shattered this doctrine completely. American ships could see perfectly in darkness, not with human eyes, but with electronic ones that were in some ways superior to daylight vision. The radar was not affected by darkness, muzzle flash, smoke, or even fog. As long as electromagnetic waves could bounce off the target and return to the antenna, the system worked flawlessly. The first major night engagement where this capability stunned Japanese forces came during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. While the main action involved carrier aircraft, several surface actions occurred in darkness. American battleships, including the newly arrived Missouri, engaged Japanese cruisers at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards in complete darkness. Japanese officers reported shells falling with impossible accuracy from an enemy they could not see. Commander Okumiya, analyzing after-action reports, wrote, "Our ships were being hit by gunfire from beyond our rangefinder capabilities. The Americans were not firing illumination shells. They were not using searchlights. Yet their fire was accurate. Our own optical rangefinders showed nothing but darkness, yet their guns found us consistently. We began to suspect they had developed night vision equipment far superior to anything we possessed." The truth was more revolutionary than enhanced optics. The Americans were not looking through superior telescopes. They were not looking at all. They were reading numbers on radar scopes and letting computers do the aiming. By October 1944, when American forces invaded the Philippines, 4 Iowa-class battleships were operational in the Pacific: Iowa, New Jersey, Missouri, and Wisconsin. Together, they formed the most powerful and technologically advanced battleship force ever assembled, and they were about to participate in the largest naval battle in history, where their unexpected accuracy would contribute to the decisive American victory. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought from October 23 to October 26, 1944, involved hundreds of ships and aircraft across an area covering thousands of square miles. For the Japanese, it was a desperate gamble to destroy the American landing force at Leyte and delay the liberation of the Philippines. For the Americans, it was an opportunity to annihilate what remained of the Imperial Japanese Navy as an effective fighting force. The Iowa-class battleships were assigned to Task Force 38, providing escort for the fast carrier groups. Their primary mission was defensive, protect the carriers from any Japanese surface threat. But if Japanese battleships came within range, the Iowas were prepared to engage. The engagement in the Sibuyan Sea on October 24 provided one of the most dramatic demonstrations of Iowa-class firepower and accuracy. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, including the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, attempted to transit the Sibuyan Sea to reach the American landing beaches. American carrier aircraft attacked relentlessly, eventually sinking Musashi. But before the air attacks achieved decisive results, USS Iowa and USS New Jersey maneuvered to engage at long range. The range at initial contact was approximately 35,000 yards, over 19 miles. Japanese optical rangefinders could barely resolve the American port ships at that distance. Kurita's fire control officers estimated range and ordered salvos fired, but the probability of hitting at such extreme distance with optical fire control alone was minimal. USS New Jersey opened fire at 32,000 yards with her forward turrets. The first salvo fell long. The radar spotted the splashes. The Mark 38 computer adjusted automatically. The second salvo, fired 40 seconds later, fell 1,000 yards short. Third salvo straddled the Japanese formation, shells landing both short and long. Fourth salvo, direct hit on the heavy cruiser Haguro. The entire sequence took less than 3 minutes. Japanese observers aboard Yamato watched in disbelief as American shells walked onto their formation with textbook precision. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What they were witnessing was not extraordinary luck. It was the systematic application of radar fire control. Lieutenant Commander Hara, stationed aboard Haguro, later described the experience in his memoir. "We saw the gun flashes from the American battleship. Then we counted. At extreme range, it takes nearly 60 seconds for a shell to arrive. We counted past 60 seconds, expecting the shells to land somewhere in the ocean around us. Then came the roar. Enormous columns of water erupted, short of our formation but not by much. Before we had fully processed this, another salvo arrived, this time long. The Americans had bracketed us with just 2 salvos at a range where bracketing should take 10 or 15 salvos." Hara continued, "The third American salvo straddled us perfectly. Shells landed on both sides of Haguro. Our captain ordered evasive maneuvers, changing course radically. The fourth salvo landed exactly where we would have been if we had maintained course. The fifth salvo adjusted for our turn and landed close alongside. The sixth salvo struck us. A 16-inch shell penetrated our portside hull and exploded in the forward engine room. We lost power. Dead in the water, we became an even easier target." What Hara did not realize at the time was that the American fire control system was tracking Haguro continuously throughout these maneuvers. The Mark 8 radar maintained lock even through the smoke and confusion of battle. The Mark 38 computer recalculated trajectories with each course change Haguro made. The American gunners were not reacting to where the Japanese cruiser was. They were firing at where the computer predicted she would be 30 seconds in the future when the shells arrived. This predictive capability was perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of radar fire control. It transformed naval gunnery from an art into a science. Human gunners, even highly trained ones, struggled to lead moving targets accurately at extreme ranges. The delays involved, the shell flight time, the target's course changes, made intuitive aiming nearly impossible. But computers did not rely on intuition. They calculated intercept points mathematically and adjusted continuously. The result was that Iowa-class battleships could engage effectively at ranges that rendered Japanese optical fire control largely ineffective. While Japanese ships could theoretically fire back, their probability of hitting was minimal. American ships, by contrast, were hitting with their 4th or 5th salvos consistently. The psychological impact of this capability on Japanese commanders cannot be overstated. Admiral Kurita, observing the accurate American gunnery from Yamato's bridge, reportedly expressed disbelief. Yamato herself mounted the largest guns ever put to sea, 18-inch weapons that could theoretically outrange the Iowa's 16-inch guns. Yet even Yamato's superior ballistics were negated by the Americans' superior targeting systems. Japanese naval doctrine had assumed that in a battleship duel, Yamato would dominate through sheer firepower and range. But domination required hitting the target. If the Americans could see and hit targets that Japanese optical systems could barely resolve, then raw gun size became irrelevant. During the surface actions at Leyte Gulf, Japanese battleships fired hundreds of shells at American ships, often with minimal effect. American battleships, including the Iowas, fired fewer shells but achieved dramatically higher hit percentages. Post-war analysis of ammunition expenditure tells the story clearly. USS New Jersey expended approximately 300 main battery rounds during surface engagements at Leyte. She scored at least 9 confirmed hits on Japanese warships. That is a hit rate of 3%, which seems low until compared to Japanese performance. Yamato fired approximately 100 main battery rounds and scored 1 confirmed hit. That is a 1% hit rate, and Yamato was fighting at closer ranges than New Jersey. The disparity became even more pronounced during night actions. On October 25th, During the Battle off Samar, American escort carriers and destroyers fought desperately against Kurita's battleships. The Iowas, stationed with the carrier groups further north, did not participate directly in that particular action. But that night, as Kurita withdrew, USS Wisconsin and USS Iowa intercepted Japanese cruisers attempting to escape through the San Bernardino Strait. The engagement occurred in complete darkness, no moon, scattered clouds. Visibility was near zero. Japanese ships had no indication that American battleships were nearby until the first salvo arrived. USS Wisconsin opened fire at 28,000 yards, detecting Japanese cruisers purely by radar. The first salvo landed close. The second salvo scored hits on the light cruiser Noshiro, setting her ablaze. Further salvos reduced 2 more cruisers to burning wrecks within 15 minutes. Japanese survivors later testified that they had no idea where the American fire was coming from. They never saw the American battleships. The gun flashes were visible, but determining range and bearing from gun flash alone in darkness is nearly impossible. By the time Japanese ships attempted to return fire, they were already heavily damaged and their fire control systems disrupted. This night action illustrated the complete technological dominance American radar fire control provided. The Americans were fighting at optimal efficiency. The Japanese were fighting nearly blind. In such conditions, Japanese training and determination meant little. You cannot fight effectively what you cannot see. By the end of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered catastrophic losses. 4 carriers sunk, 3 battleships sunk or heavily damaged, numerous cruisers and destroyers destroyed. American losses were far lighter. And significantly, not a single Iowa-class battleship was even moderately damaged. They had engaged enemy forces repeatedly, absorbed return fire when necessary, and emerged essentially untouched. For Japanese naval command, the implications were devastating. The doctrine of decisive battleship engagement, which had shaped Japanese naval planning for decades, had been rendered obsolete. Battleships remained powerful, but only if they could hit their targets. Against an enemy with radar fire control, Japanese battleships were at a fundamental disadvantage. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, reviewing reports from Leyte Gulf, reportedly stated, "The Americans have achieved something we did not anticipate. They can see in darkness and through weather. Their accuracy at extreme range defies our understanding of gunnery principles. We must assume that further surface engagements will result in similar outcomes unless we can develop countermeasures." No such countermeasures materialized. Japan lacked the industrial capacity and technological expertise to field comparable radar systems. Even if the technology could be developed, producing sufficient quantities to equip the fleet was impossible given the deteriorating war situation. American submarines had already strangled Japanese merchant shipping. Resources for advanced electronics development were not available. The Iowa-class battleships continued operating through the final year of the war. They bombarded Iwo Jima in February 1945, their 16-inch guns demolishing Japanese fortifications with precision that awed marine observers. They shelled Okinawa in April and May 1945, firing thousands of rounds in support of the bloodiest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. Throughout these operations, their accuracy remained their defining characteristic. Marines landing on hostile beaches developed an almost superstitious confidence in the Iowas. If the battleships had bombarded the landing area, defenders would be stunned, fortifications destroyed, and the assault's initial phase would succeed with fewer casualties. The Iowa's guns could drop a 2,700-pound shell into a specific bunker from 12 miles offshore. That capability saved American lives. For Japanese defenders, the experience was nightmarish. The accuracy of American naval gunfire meant that no position was safe. Concrete bunkers 30 feet underground could be penetrated by direct hits from 16-inch armor-piercing shells. Command posts carefully concealed from aerial observation were destroyed systematically. Japanese officers reported that American battleships seemed to have perfect intelligence about defensive positions. The reality was simpler. American fire control radar could map terrain with considerable precision. Shore bombardment missions used specialized radar systems that could detect individual buildings and terrain features. These radar returns were compared with aerial reconnaissance photographs. Fire control officers could designate specific targets by coordinates. The computer calculated the trajectory, the guns fired, the target ceased to exist. This capability transformed shore bombardment from area suppression into precision strike. Pre-war naval gunfire doctrine assumed that ships bombarding shore targets would fire hundreds of shells to saturate an area, hoping that some would hit important targets. The Iowa-class battleships could and did engage in saturation fire when appropriate, but they could also engage in precision fire, systematically destroying designated targets one by one. Japanese military analysis during the war's final months grew increasingly pessimistic. Intelligence officers compiled reports on American technological capabilities, including detailed assessments of radar fire control systems based on observations from survivors and captured documents. These reports acknowledged that Japan had no answer to American radar technology. Recommendations focused on avoiding surface engagements entirely and relying on kamikaze attacks and coastal defense in depth to inflict maximum casualties before inevitable defeat. The Imperial Japanese Navy's remaining battleships, including Yamato, were essentially useless. They could not safely venture into waters where American carrier aircraft could attack them. They could not effectively engage American surface forces that could detect and target them from beyond visual range. They consumed fuel and resources while contributing nothing to Japan's defense. Yamato's final sortie in April 1945, a one-way suicide mission to Okinawa, illustrated this hopelessness. The super battleship was sunk by carrier aircraft before ever reaching its destination, never firing a shot at enemy surface ships. The contrast with the Iowa class was stark. The Iowas operated throughout the war with virtual impunity, engaging targets when necessary, surviving everything the Japanese threw at them, and continuing to serve for decades afterward. The technological superiority represented by Iowa-class fire control radar was merely one aspect of American dominance in the Pacific War. But it was a crucial aspect that directly affected combat outcomes. In naval warfare, hitting the enemy before he can hit you is fundamental. The Iowa-class battleships could do exactly that, consistently, at ranges and under conditions where Japanese ships could not effectively reply. The 2,700-pound shells fired by Iowa-class guns were devastating weapons. Each armor-piercing projectile was a massive cylinder of hardened steel filled with approximately 40 pounds of explosive. When these shells struck a ship, the impact was catastrophic. The shell would penetrate armor, travel deep into the ship's interior, and then detonate, creating blast effects and fragmentation that killed crew members and destroyed equipment throughout multiple compartments. High explosive shells, used for shore bombardment, were even more destructive against soft targets. These shells contained approximately 150 pounds of high explosive. The detonation created a blast wave that could collapse buildings and bunkers. Fragmentation from the shell casing killed personnel across a wide radius. A single 16-inch high-explosive shell could destroy a building or crater a road. Firing 9 such shells every 30 seconds created devastation difficult to comprehend. Japanese troops who survived Iowa-class bombardments described the experience in almost apocalyptic terms. The ground shook continuously. The noise was deafening, literally causing permanent hearing damage. Concussion from near misses killed men even inside fortifications. The psychological effect was profound. Survivors reported feeling utterly helpless, knowing that survival was pure chance rather than any action they could take. This combination of destructive power and precision accuracy was what truly stunned Japanese commanders. They had expected American battleships to be powerful. Every navy had battleships. But the ability to deliver that power with such accuracy, at such range, under any conditions, transformed these weapons from area effect systems into precision instruments. Admiral Minechi Koga, who commanded the combined fleet before his death in March 1944, had predicted that American industrial superiority would eventually overwhelm Japan. But even Koga had not anticipated the speed with which technological innovations like radar fire control would render Japanese naval capabilities obsolete. The assumption had been that both sides would fight with similar technologies, and that Japanese training and dedication might offset American material advantages. That assumption died at Leyte Gulf. The Americans were not just producing more ships, they were producing fundamentally superior ships, and the gap was not one that Japanese industry could close. Even if Japan had captured an Iowa-class fire control radar intact and fully understood its principles, manufacturing equivalent systems in sufficient quantities was beyond Japanese industrial capacity by late 1944. This technological disparity extended beyond radar. American damage control procedures were superior. American logistics systems kept ships supplied and operational. American naval aviators had better aircraft, better training, and more combat experience. American submarines were strangling Japanese supply lines. The list of advantages was overwhelming, but in surface combat, radar fire control was the decisive advantage. It allowed American ships to dictate engagement ranges and conditions. It allowed them to hit targets that Japanese ships could barely detect. It made American battleships not just powerful, but effectively dominant in any surface engagement. The Iowa-class battleships continued serving long after World War II ended. They were modernized repeatedly, receiving upgraded electronics, missile systems, and improved crew habitability. They saw combat in Korea, Vietnam, and the Persian Gulf. USS Missouri was finally decommissioned in 1992, 50 years after her commissioning. Today, all 4 Iowa-class battleships survive as museum ships. Their longevity testifies to the excellence of their original design, but their combat effectiveness in World War II testified to something more important: the revolutionary impact of radar fire control. The Japanese had never expected American battleships to fire 2,700-pound shells, 23 miles accurately, because such accuracy had never been possible before. Optical fire control could not achieve it. Mechanical computers could not calculate trajectories quickly enough. But radar-directed electronic fire control could, and did, achieve it. And that capability changed naval warfare forever. Japanese commanders who survived the war acknowledged this in post-war interviews. They had been stunned not just by American industrial capacity, though that was overwhelming. They had been stunned by American technological innovation. The Iowa-class battleships embodied both advantages. They were built in numbers Japan could not match, and they incorporated technology Japan could not replicate. In the end, the surprise was complete. Japanese naval doctrine had prepared for many contingencies, but it had not prepared for an enemy that could see in darkness, calculate perfectly under pressure, and land shells with near certainty at ranges where visibility was meaningless. The Iowa-class battleships demonstrated that modern warfare belonged to those who mastered not just steel and explosives, but electronics and mathematics. The guns themselves were magnificent examples of manufacturing precision. Each 16-inch barrel was machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, but the barrels alone were insufficient. What made them truly deadly was the invisible electronic web that guided them: radar transmitters and receivers, analog computers solving differential equations hundreds of times per minute, servomotors and gyroscopes feeding position data continuously. Japanese sailors who encountered Iowa-class gunnery firsthand never forgot it. The impossible accuracy, the relentless salvos, the sense that no evasion would help because the Americans were not aiming at where you were, but where you would be. That prescience, born of electronic calculation rather than human intuition, was what truly shocked Japan's naval command. They had prepared to fight human opponents. They found themselves fighting machines that thought faster and saw farther than any human could. And those machines, mounted on fast, heavily armoured hulls, proved unstoppable. The thunder of Iowa-class guns echoed across the Pacific from 1944 until war's end. For American forces, that thunder was reassuring. the sound of overwhelming power deployed precisely where needed. For Japanese forces, it was terrifying, the sound of an enemy who could reach out and destroy them before they even knew they were targeted. The myth of the invincible super battleship died when Yamato sank under aerial attack in April 1945. But the myth of Japanese naval equality had died earlier, in the dark waters around Leyte Gulf, where American radar pierced the night and American shells fell with impossible accuracy. The Iowa-class battleships did not just win battles, they demonstrated that Japan's entire naval doctrine had been rendered obsolete by technology Japan had not anticipated and could not counter. Lieutenant Commander Hara survived the war and wrote extensively about his experiences. Decades later, discussing the Battle of Leyte Gulf, he reflected, "We prepared for years to fight American battleships. We studied their designs, analyzed their capabilities, trained our crews to exploit their weaknesses. But when we finally encountered them in battle, we discovered they were not the ships we had prepared to fight. They were something new, something we had no answer for. They could see us when we could not see them. They could hit us when we could not hit them." Against such an opponent, courage and training were insufficient. We needed technology we did not possess. And by the time we understood this, the war was already lost. That realization came too late to change outcomes. But it came with stunning clarity to every Japanese officer who witnessed Iowa-class battleships in action. The Americans had not just built bigger guns, they had reinvented naval combat itself, and in that reinvention, Japan found not an equal opponent prepared for honorable combat, but a technologically superior force that had already moved beyond the warfare. Japan's leaders thought they were fighting. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.